Welcome back to part 2 of our video on the KSR-420S, and in this part we'll be focusing on the finishing touches for the rocket. And so one of the things I'm going to do is use some of this plastic model putty to fill in some of the gaps here that were left on the nose cone. Some of these sanded down already, that like I showed you in the first video. Here I'm just going to put a little bead of this stuff along the seam where I can still see lines. I don't necessarily have to do the whole thing, and I don't need a lot. Okay, so for that side, and I'm just going to take a little wooden dowel applicator here, and I'm going to use that to smooth this in. And this stuff dries fairly quickly, so you don't want to wait too long to work it. Okay, and a little bit of over wipe here. What do you call that? A little bit of excess is not a big problem because we're going to sand it off again. Alright, and then I'm just going to look for any of the really obvious places, like right there. Again, this is already getting stiff, so I'm working pretty quickly. Okay, and this is just going to fill in some of those little cracks and holes, and it means I won't have to use as much primer on it later on. Alright, and then I'm just going to put a little bit more on down here, fill in that little seam. Looks like just a big scratch right there. Okay, so once again we'll just smooth that in while it's still nice and pliable. And then I'm just going to let this dry, and then I'll sand it off camera. You guys have seen me sanding enough on these things. But I'm going to sand this with some extra fine sandpaper, either 220 or 400 grit. Now I want to do a little bit of touch up on the fillets, mostly on the launch lugs here before I paint it, because we did have a little bit of bubbling here. I don't know if you can see that too well. And I'm going to go ahead and use this model putty again and just run a bead in there. Now this isn't going to provide a lot of strength. You don't want to use this in place of glue fillets, but it will fill in the little bubbles and also give it a little more of a contour into the body tube. And then to smooth this, I'm just going to use this little hobby tool. I've got a set of these I picked up at a hobby store for a few bucks. And I'm just going to use that now to shape this. If you don't have one of these, you could use a rubber gloved finger. But since this does have at least some solvents in it, it's best not to use a bare finger on it. And here you gotta be careful that you don't do this too much, or you're going to end up doing a lot of sanding later. Okay. There we go. And so the excess there I'll just sand off again. I've already done the forward launch lug in kind of the same way. And this is also a good time to check and make sure you don't have any problems with your fin fillets. And I really don't see any there. Now another thing I'm going to do before painting is I want to clean any sawdust that is still on the fins. And I've already brushed off what I could, but there's still a little bit there that just kind of sticks into the grain. And so here I've got a tissue that's moistened but not dripping with rubbing alcohol. I'm just going to use that to remove anything that's still kind of sticking on there. And now I'm going to make sure and let this dry for at least a few hours before I go on to the next step of painting. But even before that, I'll also need to come back and sand down the putty. I've sanded all of the filler putty that I've put on here. And you can still see a little bit of roughness there, like right around the seam. And my next step is going to use a filler type of primer to finish filling in the little cracks and crevices here. It will also fill in some of the grooves of the spiral tube here. And before painting, I've done two things here. One is I've stuffed some tissue down the top of this. And you can just use wherever you got available, paper towel or something works well. This is just to keep paint out of the top of the rocket so that it doesn't get onto the shock cord or the ejection baffle. And then the other thing I've got here is this little rocket holder, and I make these out of dowels and spent engines. And you can check my video for uses for spent engines for how to make these and other useful gadgets. But I'm going to put this into one of the engine tubes here, just to give me something extra to hold on to instead of the rocket itself. And you'll notice I'm wearing disposable gloves here, and this is simply because I always end up getting a little bit of paint on my fingers no matter how careful I am holding the rocket. And this way I don't have to keep scrubbing paint out of my fingernails and such. So when I come back, I'll have the filler coat of primer put on this, and after that dries I will sand that down and then apply a flat primer on top of that. My primer has dried overnight, and so it's ready for sanding. And some people like to sand most of this away, and then that leaves just a little bit filling the grooves and such. I don't like to go quite that far. You can see here, for example, on the fins, there's some sawdust and just some residual wood here that's gotten caught in this. And that's actually good, because this will be easier to sand smooth that way. So I'm going to go through and sand this down with some 150 grit sandpaper. You can use a finer sandpaper as well. I'm going to start with a 150 just to get some of the heavier stuff off, and then go to a finer sandpaper. And then when I'm done, I'll give this another coat of primer, but it'll just be a flat white primer rather than this filling primer here. Now I will warn you, this stuff clogs up sandpaper really quickly, so you're going to want to have a decent supply on hand. I've done my first round of sanding, and now I'm just going to take some tissue here and wipe off any dust. And you can see where some of the tube is now showing through, along with some of the wood of the fins. And that's okay, that's what this stuff is made for. As I said, some people will sand this even further down so that only the filled cracks and crevices show the primer. I don't enjoy sanding enough to do that. And then after you've used a dry tissue there, now I'm going to take a little bit more tissue and moisten it with just a little bit of rubbing alcohol, and use this like a tack cloth to pick up any more dust particles remaining here. Okay, one of the things that can happen if you leave dust behind is that can catalyze crinkling of your paint. And something I've noticed since when I started doing this in the 70s is that the changes in spray paint formulations that are supposed to make them easier to coat also seem to make them more prone to crinkling their finish. And there are lots of threads on social media about this, lots of different possible reasons and remedies for it. But one of the things I found that does help prevent it is doing this. So wipe down the rocket between sandings with just a little bit of rubbing alcohol. And also make sure you're using the same brand of paint throughout the process. And if possible, the same line of paint within that brand. Okay, so you don't want to use, say a primer from one brand and then a finishing coat from another brand and then a clear coat from yet another brand. You're probably going to run into compatibility issues. Alright, now I'm going to let this dry for a little bit, but I can go through and check where I might need to do some additional sanding. I may need to touch up a few places here, but for the most part I'm happy with it. And so now I'm going to put on several coats of flat white primer that's not specifically meant to be a filler. And that's something else here. If you're changing paints or if you're adding multiple layers of paint, read your directions first. But most spray paints will say now that if you're recoating, you either need to do it within 15 minutes of the previous coat or after 4 or more hours, and that's going to depend on the paint. And so when I go to put my next layer of primer on here, this paint's already dried for 24 hours, so I can put multiple layers of primer on it as long as I do it within 15 minutes. And generally you can do it after about 5 minutes for each coat. And just do light coats, don't try and cover the whole thing at once. But after I've got my primer coat on, I'm going to let that completely dry again for 24 to 48 hours, give it a light sanding, and then start applying my finishing paint. While I'm waiting for my rubbing alcohol to completely dry off of this, I'm going to show you an optional bit of construction you can do here, and that is to reinforce the motor mount tubes here. In general, Rocketarium tends to use a little bit thinner material for their motor mount tubes, and this saves some mass, but it also means the edges are a little bit more prone to wear. And especially where this rocket is using friction fit, they may wear even more. So one of the things you can do to help prolong the life of them is just take some regular super glue, some cyanoacrylate, and just run it around the outside of those tubes. The idea here is to let the glue soak into the cardboard. Okay, and you can actually do this before you start painting on it. You want to be a little bit careful here, and you don't want to get this on the inside of the tubes. Now you might be thinking, well, the inside ought to soak in better, and yes it will. And there are instances where you can do that. But what I would suggest is, if you're going to do this, go ahead and just do the outsides of the tubes first. Okay, let those completely dry, and then try putting motors in it. Alright, and make sure that the motors still fit, because even with this soaking through, it could cause a slight change in the diameter. And if they do get a little bit too small, you can take just a little bit of sanding paper and sand that out. Now, if they're still fairly loose after you're done with this step, then you can consider putting a layer on the inside and then letting that harden. Now, that's almost guaranteed to make this tighter, and you probably will have to sand it a little bit with some extra fine sandpaper. Again, this is a completely optional step and is not necessary for the flight of the rocket. In a similar fashion, you might also want to consider applying a little bit of super glue around the inside edge of the forward end of the body tube here. Again, you don't need much, just enough to soak in there. And this will help keep the body tube from folding in or crushing when you put the nose cone in. But again, this may change how your nose cone fits, so it may require you to do a little bit of sanding either inside the tube or on the shoulder of your nose cone. Make sure you've got a safe nose cone connection before you go to fly. And here I'm not going to wait too long for this to soak in. Since I have lots of room here, I'm just going to take a tissue now and wipe around that inside edge. Okay, so that'll still give me the strength there without having a lot of excess glue that I'm going to have to sand away later. Okay. And once more, this is also optional, is not needed for the flight of the rocket. I painted the rocket using the procedure described in the instructions. So I started out by painting the whole thing flat white with primer, and then painted the two colored fins by masking off the rest of the rocket, painting those and then switching the masks so that the colored fins were masked while I painted the entire rest of the rocket gloss white. Alright, we are ready to put the decals on now. Now my nose cone, I tried doing some masking to do the red here. I didn't like the way it came out, so I ended up sanding that off and repainting it. What I'm going to do is brush on the red later on after I do the decal, because I can use one of the nose decals as kind of a guide for hand painting this. There are both water slide decals here, and we're going to do those second. The instructions recommend doing the two vinyl decals first. And a good way to do this is ahead of time have some soapy water. So I've just got a little tray of water here, and to that I'm just going to add 1 drop of dishwashing detergent. And I'm just going to use my finger here to stir that in. I don't want a lot of bubbles, but I do want this thoroughly mixed in here, so check for little floaties and sinkies in there. And the water just needs to be room temperature, nothing special about it. But this will aid in putting the vinyl decals on without having to worry about ripping up the paint. So in our instructions, okay, they recommend putting the vinyl strip on first, and this is going to be 4 inches down from the forward end of the upper tube. Okay, so I'm just going to rearrange things here a little bit. So on my upper body tube here, so I'm just going to measure 4 inches down here. Just put a little mark right there. And now you can either kind of freehand this around, or you can use a marking guide. One way to do it is just take a piece of paper and wrap it around, and then just very lightly draw with pencil all the way around that. Alternatively, if you have one of the SD's tube cutting guides, you might be able to slip that on, or not. Now the paint's made this too thick. Okay, so I'm just going to use a scrap of paper here. It's actually the instructions from the ejection baffle. And I'm going to have a piece of masking tape handy. And now I'm just going to wrap this around. Okay, now I don't need the entire length of this here, so I'm just going to cut it off. Okay, and I just need the two edges to match up, and then I can move that right to my little line there. I'm just going to tack that in place with a little bit of masking tape, and I'm just going to draw a really faint line around this. Yeah. Alright, and the silver strip goes right below that. So here I'm just going to bend up the edge. If you don't have good fingernails, you can use the edge of your hobby knife. Okay, now in the instructions it says you can just dip a finger in the soapy water and put that along the inside of the decal or along the rocket itself. That works just fine. I actually prefer to just dip the whole thing in here and put a thin film of soapy water along there. It's essentially doing the same thing. Now keep in mind you never want to do this with an unfinished rocket, because if you've got bare cardboard here, it will damage the cardboard. Okay, and now I'm going to put this on so that the leading edge of the decal is right over the line, and that way it'll hide the line for me. Okay, and now as I come around, I'm just going to keep a little bit of tension on it. It's wanting to walk more than I want it to there. Okay. Doesn't look like it's quite straight. And this is where the soapy water comes in. This makes the adhesive just a little bit less tacky. Okay, and now I can go ahead and just pull that around, adjusting it as I need to. Okay, and then if I get it right, it should just meet itself on the other side. And now I'll just take a tissue here and wipe off the water. Put some pressure on that so it forces any little water bubbles out. And that one's ready to go. So I'm going to set that aside. Now this next part's going to be a little bit harder to mark. It needs to be 2.5 inches from the tip of the nose cone here. And so I'm going to stand this up. Make a mark there. Okay, looks pretty good. Alright, and then they suggest putting another mark at 2 3/4 inches right below that. I'm not quite sure why, because this will easily, well, maybe not easily, but as long as you're using that as your top mark, you should be able to do this without much problem. Okay, now the same way, I'm going to just run this through the water quick. Now if you're capable of drawing a circle all the way around at 2.5 and 2 3/4 inches, that probably actually would be very good. But that creates its own dilemmas. And so this, I'm just going to go ahead and try a freehand approach here. Right, they don't quite line up. So here I can pull it back off, and one, I'm going to put a little bit of tension on there. And this is a case where you just got to keep trying a few times here. So I'm going to bring it back, lower it just a little bit. Okay, and this is telling me I'm down too far on the cone. So what I can do here is come up a little bit. Alright, so I'm just going to give a fraction, maybe about a millimeter there, above my line. And now come around. That's looking better. I just need to apply a little bit more tension there. Okay, so it's overlapping now, but it's not quite straight. And so you just got to keep doing this until you get it just right there. And now once again, I'm going to take a tissue, bring that around. Okay. And still not quite happy with that. I'm going to bring that out. Okay, and bring it down all the way around. Sometimes if you can just do all this in one fluid motion instead of trying to check where you are the whole time, it actually gets a little bit easier. Might take a few tries. Okay, but I'm pretty happy with that. Next I'm going to apply the water slide decals, and because of their size, these are fairly large, these can be a little bit tricky to do. And so what we want to do first of all is mark where it's going to go. So the first one is this red and white roll pattern here. And that needs to go 3/4 of an inch, or about 19 millimeters below the silver band here. So I'm going to go metric this time. So 19 millimeters is going to be right there. Alright, the trick to doing these is getting the decals soaked long enough that they will move off the backing, but not so long that we lose all the glue. Okay, and so in the instructions it says to submerge this for 40 seconds. Okay, so, and I like to do it face down. You don't necessarily have to do it that way. Okay, so I'm just going to time this. As it's sitting here, I can see that the back is done, so I'm going to go ahead and bring this up. See, this is one of the reasons I like to do it upside down, is they don't curl as badly. But I also like to see if it's starting to separate. But what we need to do is get to the point where the entire decal will slide at once. That should be about time, so I'm going to just take this here, and I'm just going to take my thumbs and try and move it. Okay, and it is sliding there. And I'm going to take just a little bit on my finger here and apply just a little bit of a film around this. Usually this isn't a big deal, you'll get a film of water around it anyway. Alright, now the trick here is going to get this to align and also not rip. So you do need to be gentle here. So what I'm going to do is just slide it off a little bit so you can see the edge of the decal there. And I'm going to bring this up. Now when I align this, I need to align the pattern, not necessarily the edge of the decal, which might be off a little bit. Alright, so I'm going to do it like that, and now back here, I'm going to hold the edge with my thumb, and now I'm going to gently pull the paper out. Okay, don't try and change direction, even if you're off center a little bit, that's fine. We'll fix it later. Alright, and that's wrapped all the way around there. Now here, if you do need to move it, put some water on and just slide it a bit. Okay, so I'm going to move this whole thing very carefully so that one of the bigger squares there is at my mark. Alright, and now I'm just going to gently move and pull on this to get the wrinkles out. Okay. And this big one's probably the worst one, just because of its size and that it has to wrap around itself. Okay, what we want to avoid is what's trying to happen here. You don't want it to cling to its own underside. If we can help that. There we go. Okay. So now I'm going to move this around again. Alright. And I'm going to take my other end now and I'm going to try and scoot it up onto the other end. Alright, now if it's looking like it's drying out, again, go ahead and just get a little bit of water here. Because once this dries, it's really hard to work with. Okay. But now, I'm just going to wrap this around. Alright, it moved a little bit farther than I wanted to, but that's okay. What I'm going to do is just keep turning it and sliding it as I go, so I hide that little mark again. Oops. Okay, and again, you got to be really careful about your movements, because the purpose of these decals is to make your life miserable. And that one really wanted to fold there again. That over. Now I'm going to take tissue here and I'm just going to very lightly moisten it. And now I'm going to start working my way around this. Okay, now sometimes you get something like that, just be careful around it. Alright, you're taking your moistened tissue here and just work your way around. And then some people like to clear coat decals, others don't, and my own experience has been kind of hit and miss with it. I suggest if you're going to use a clear coat, use an acrylic one. And if possible, test it somewhere that you're not going to see before you stick it on the rocket. These little wrinkles, again, you can, if you're careful, you can gently pull those out. If it looks like you're going to rip it though, I prefer just to leave it a little bit wrinkly. Alright, just smooth them in like this. And if you put a clear coat on, it'll hide some of those wrinkles. The remaining decals are actually just 2 of them, but they're on the same sheet. And so we want to cut these out as close as we can. So the first decal here is everything from the red lettering down. Alright, and the instructions say to cut this as closely as we can. And these little scraps I'm making, you can use those to practice your decal positioning, because they still have the decal film on them. Okay, so this one is going to go down here like this. Alright, so we're going to have, if the rocket is facing nose to the left here, the red writing will go at the top, and the end of this, the right edge of this, will go right above the leading edges of the fins. And then we'll just run the rest of it upward. So this will take about 20 to 30 seconds in the water. And you may have realized, as I have, that I'm still using the soapy water here. You don't need to. In fact, it's probably better if you don't. But it's not going to hurt much either. Normally, if I'm just doing water slide decals, I'll just use a fresh little tray of water here. But if you're like me and use the same tray for both of these, it's probably not going to hurt anything, as long as you didn't put an excess amount of detergent in there. Okay, so let's see if this is sliding yet. Not quite. Well, I can see it's starting to lift there. There we go. Okay, so again, I'm just going to slide a little bit of the edge off there. And I'm going to place that where I want it on the rocket. And I'm going to gently pull the backing paper out. As I'm doing this, the wet backing paper is also putting some moisture on the rocket, so I really don't have to do that separately. Okay, and now I can just gently slide this to where I want it to go. And then I'm going to go ahead and just take another tissue here. And I don't have to smooth out any wrinkles or bubbles too much on this one. So if you want, you might even want to do this one first if you don't have a lot of experience putting water slide decals on, because this one's easier to do than the wrap at the top. Alright, and then our final decal here is going to go about 19 millimeters above this, and I've got it upside down, so this should go like this. And I'm going to go ahead here again and cut out the excess. Another little trick I've seen people do with water slide decals is to add a drop of Elmer's glue to the water. And I think the idea there is that it will help the native adhesive work better, especially if you've left it in too long and you may have worn off some of the decal glue. But it's not enough that it's going to interfere with how it looks or anything like that. Okay, so this is going to go approximately 19 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch from the lettering here. And so here I'm measuring the lettering, not the decal itself. It's going to go right about there. It was a little bit too light. And this one's probably only going to take about 10 or 15 seconds to soak. Not quite there yet. Okay, that's feeling a little slippery. Just so. There we go. Alright, so I'm going to check my orientation once more. And this. Just like before, I've got a little edge showing, and I just anchor that with my finger and pull out the paper. Okay, and then I'm going to reposition this so it's where I need it to be. And here, basically I'm taking the line, the cross line here of this character, and trying to match that up with the top edge of the inverted characters here. And then once more, dab off the excess. Alright, I like that. Maybe just a little bit crooked there. Okay, and that is it for the decorations. So you will want to wait at least 24 hours before you do anything else to this. So don't launch it for 24 hours. If you're going to put a clear coat over the decals, wait 24 hours on that. And there are a couple of different clear coats. Some are basically made just for the decal, and you apply them just around the decal itself and not the whole rocket. In other cases, you may want to clear coat the entire rocket. In any case, be sure to do a little bit of a test somewhere that's not going to be conspicuous. So, for example, you could use some of these scraps on a piece of blank cardboard or something like that. Try the clear coat. Make sure it's not going to cause them to raise up or crinkle or anything like that. And with that, this part of the video is finished. Actually, it's not. Okay, but the decoration is finished. I'll finish the nose cone painting off camera. I've been putting off attaching the parachute until I had the paint and decals all done. And now that I've reached that point, you can do this in one of two ways. You can just follow the directions and tie the parachute directly to the nose cone. But if you've seen any of my rocket videos, you'll know that I don't like to do this. Alright, instead, I prefer to use a snap swivel like this one. And you can get these at almost any sporting goods store in the fishing section. So the first thing I'm going to do is just unfold the parachute, and then I'm going to gather all the shroud lines together around a finger and thumb here. And then I'm going to pull at the center and then just allow those lines to slip a little bit as I adjust this so that all of the corners here come up close together. They don't have to be exact, and the shroud lines are often off by a little bit. Right, and now I'm going to pinch this so I don't lose the position of the shroud lines. And as I work this, I always want to keep it so that the line length doesn't change. And now I'm simply going to take my loop of shroud lines, pass them through the swivel side, and then pass the entire swivel through this. All right, and then I'm just going to pull that loop down and over, and then let it tie itself onto the base of the swivel loop here. Okay, and then I'm just going to take a little dab of white glue or wood glue, okay, and it doesn't take a lot. I'm just going to put a little bit in there and work it into the knot, and it's just so it doesn't come loose and change the length of the shroud lines. Okay, and so now it's all together like this. And now I can take the rocket here, and it's got the shock cord still up inside of it here, out of the way during the painting. It's kind of a long rocket for a little bit of workspace here. Alright, and I'm going to tie my shock cord on to the nose cone here. And I'm just going to tie that on with a couple of half hitches. Just snug those down really well. Alright, and then I like to pull it from both directions here. So pull it from the shock cord end, and then pull the free end, and then pull them both together so that knot doesn't slip. And then I'm going to cut off the free end back to about 1/2 centimeter here. So I don't want to be right at the knot, but I also don't want the free end to be able to get caught up between the shoulder of the nose cone and the body tube. And then just like I did on the parachute shrouds, I'm just going to put a little dab of glue in here. Again, use white or wood glue. Plastic cement or super glue can damage the shock cord. Just work that in a little bit. Okay, and then let that dry. Once it is dry and you're ready for launch, then just take your shock cord clip and hook it onto the eyelet. And this is really what determines the size of the snap swivel you need. The weight of the rocket and the shock of the parachute opening is going to be well within the rated limits of just about any of these. But if you get one that's too small, it may not fit on the eyelet here of the nose cone. And especially the nose cones that Rocketarium uses tend to be much heavier. The ones I see Estes using tends to have a thinner loop here, and so you can use a smaller snap swivel with that. Alright, but once you've got it over the loop, then just activate the snap there and get it into place, and then all you have to do is fold up the parachute and you're ready to launch. And with that, this rocket is complete. Have a really good launch, have a safe recovery, and you'll see me on the next video. Within the model rocketry community, there has been a movement away from elastic shock cords and toward using Kevlar shock cords. Now, I find that elastic is good in some situations and not as good in others. The problem with elastic is that it does deteriorate over time. So even if you never use it, oxidation just from being in the air is going to make that shock cord weaker over time, which is why sometimes people who might forgot they have a rocket and they put it in the closet or something like that, 10 years, 15 years later, they find it again, launch it, and the shock cord breaks, even though they never used it. And that's simply due to rubber deterioration. Now, if you add in ejection charges where you have increased heat and chemical action from the black powder, that weakens it further. Kevlar on the other hand, is much lighter than rubber. It's a whole lot stronger than rubber, and it's virtually fireproof. The drawback is that it is not elastic at all. It's a static line, which means you have to use a lot more of it when you are replacing a rubber shock cord. The overall rule of thumb is that you want a minimum shock cord length of 3 times the rocket length. So for our KSR, it's about 25-ish inches long, maybe a little bit longer. I'm just going to, for safety's sake, it's 3 feet long. So I'm going to use a 9-foot shock cord here. Now it seems like it's going to be really long. It's on the long side, but it's not going to hurt anything. And again, because it's so much thinner here, that 9-foot shock cord is still going to weigh less than the shock cord made out of 1/4-inch rubber that came with it. So to do this, we're first going to need to measure this out. Now for this one, I am using a 100-pound test Kevlar. It has a working load of 20 pounds, right, which is a whole lot more than anything this rocket's going to experience. Right, so I'm just going to take and wrap this around my ruler a few times. All right, so there's 9 feet. And if you have some heavier shock cord, so for example, I also typically use a 350 pound, which is about twice the diameter. It certainly won't hurt it, it's just going to weigh a little bit more. Okay, so back when we're assembling the ejection baffle here, we're going to attach this just like we did in the case of the rubber shock cord. Now since we do have such a disparity between the shock cord diameter and the screw hook here, I'm going to do a couple of things to even increase the strength of my knot. One is I'm going to make a loop around this once, like that. Alright, and now I'm going to go ahead and attach this using several half hitches. And one of the things about Kevlar is it does not hold a knot as well as rubber does, in part because of its non-elastic nature. This stuff does not stretch at all. So you want a good sturdy knot there. Now you also may have noticed that Kevlar frays really easily. And so what I'm going to do here is just take a little bit of super glue. Okay, and I'm going to place a little bit on the knot here and just let that soak in. And this is perfectly okay to do with Kevlar. You don't want to do it with rubber. And then I'm also going to coat the edge here where it's all frayed out. I'm going to trim that in just a moment. And then up on the other end here, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to let those dry for just a minute or two here. All right, and to speed things up here, I'm going to use a little bit of super glue Accelerator, which is just isopropyl alcohol. That'll cure it a little bit faster. And then just take a tissue and wipe off the excess. Okay, and I can do the same thing down here. Try not to get too much on the cardboard there, but it'll evaporate quickly. And again, wipe this area off. The knot I'm not that concerned about. You can wipe off the excess if you want to there and just dab it off. Okay, and then down here, once that glue is hardened, I'm just going to take my hobby knife and cut it where there's still glue there. And now I've got a nice clean edge without the fraying, and it won't get in the way when we go to put this in the rocket. Okay, up here on the other end, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to cut off that little frayed piece, and that'll leave me a nice clean edge. And when I get to the end of the rocket build, I'll just tie this onto the nose cone in the same manner that I did with the rubber, except instead of locking it in place with white glue, I'll lock it in place with the super glue. Okay, and with that, you've pretty much got it made there. Do make sure that when you get your rocket all together that you do a stability check. Anytime that you modify a kit from what the manufacturer suggests, you run the risk of changing the center of gravity ratio to the center of pressure. And if you do that too much, you end up with an unstable rocket. Now, before I end this part of the video, I do want to bring up one of the cons to using Kevlar. Okay, so I'm just going to put this into an extra body tube for demonstration here. Alright, but this is going to be mounted something like this, where the actual baffle is way down inside there. Okay, and because Kevlar is so tough, it also makes Kevlar line abrasive. And what can happen here is if your parachute comes out and you get a drift over to an angle like this, it can cut into your body tube, causing what's called a zipper, where it actually rips down through here. And there are a couple of things that you can do to help prevent that. One is to simply take a piece of masking tape and place it around the cord where it's going to hit the body tube. Okay, and you can do this in a couple of layers. The hard part is getting it to stick where and when you want it to. Okay, and it doesn't even have to be that pretty. Basically, you just want all the sticky parts together so that now it creates kind of a bumper here, and it distributes a lot of that tension over a wider area. The other thing you can do, and I'm going to pull this out while I do it, is you can take your super glue, either the normal type or the extra thin type, and just run a shallow bead around the inside of the tube right along the edge. Okay, and then just let that soak in for just a few seconds. You don't want it to last for too long here. And then just take a few tissues and wipe up the excess. And then once this hardens, it will make it harder to rip through the edges there. Now, it may also require that you do a little bit of sanding inside to get whatever's going into this body tube, whether it be a coupler or this or the nose cone, to fit properly. But in general, this is going to give you a tougher edge that will be more resistant to tearing by Kevlar. You can also do similar types of things anywhere that you have two tubes that are going to join together and still need to come apart. You can also do it to the edges of your motor mounts. Again, just be careful. You may have to sand it out to keep the motor fitting properly, but it'll help keep that chamfering and ripping of the edges of the tubes, especially that happens around motor mounts. Okay, hope this is helpful to you. And again, as I mentioned before, if you can make any of these modifications, always check for stability and make sure your rocket is still stable before flying it.